Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. As a reminder, please note that this audit committee meeting is being recorded for the convenience of those unable to attend this video conference. Aday, could you please call roll?
Yes. John Maderick.
Oh my goodness. I'm present.
Thank you. Nicholas Saudo. Russell Buckley for for Benjamin Schambach, sorry.
Russell Buckley present for Chancellor David Banks and interim CFO Benjamin Schambach.
Tom Shepard.
Present.
Karina Tavares. Present. Anthony Lopez.
Present.
Gregory Faulkner.
Present.
Alan Ong.
Present.
Allison Hirsch.
John Dorsa for Alison Hirsch and Brad Lambert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aday. We have a quorum. The first order of business is agenda item number 2, noting the minutes of the audit committee of BERS held on June 14th, 2022. The minutes have been previously provided to the committee via SharePoint site. May I please have a motion to consider the minutes from the June 14th committee meeting?
So moved.
Greg got that. I'll second it.
First from Greg, second from Tom. Please raise your hand if you vote to approve the minutes. Aye, Russ.
Aye, Tom.
Aye, Alan.
Aye, Anthony.
So I'm gonna abstain because we weren't on the board at that time. So I think it wouldn't be appropriate for us to approve the minutes. The controller rather to consent to that. So we're just gonna abstain.
Thank you. Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is number 3, Executive Director's Update. Sandy.
I've got really nothing to offer. I suggest we use our time to review the materials.
Thank you, Sandy. The next item on the agenda is number 4, Internal Audit Director's Update. Aday. Aday, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute trying to figure out how to unmute while sharing. Apologies. So are you guys able to see my screen?
We are.
Yes.
Okay. So today, the agenda will include audits that have been completed since the last audit committee meeting. I'll touch briefly on audits that are currently ongoing, and I will provide the committee with an update on the status of prior audit findings. So diving right in, the first audit for today is the procurement audit. This audit was reported out in September of 2022, last month. And Stacy is here from Baker Tilly to tell us about this audit. Stacy?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Aday said, we completed the procurement audit, which aimed at reviewing procurement processes and transactions to make sure that those were in compliance with applicable regulations. And then, also to identify opportunities for process improvements. So as far as the regulations that we tested compliance with, we had pulled key requirements from the PPB rules, the DOE rules, and Directive 24. And then additionally, we were reviewing those practices against industry best practices as well. So I think it's important to provide a little context on this one. Our audit period and the transactions that we reviewed as part of the audit occurred between June of 2019 and March of 2022. But BERS did not actually have a dedicated procurement employee or function until 2021. So you know, definitely a large portion of the transactions that we were reviewing kind of happened before that dedicated personnel was in place. And obviously, you know, having just brought someone on in, you know, 2021, while there have definitely been efforts and improvements, and, you know, I know they're working on developing a procurement policy and things like that. I think we need to make sure that as we're reviewing these findings, we're kind of understanding the background, that you know, the resources that were kind of needed to dedicate to this function had not really been in place, and things are still, you know, kind of in the startup process. So just to go through each one of these findings, the first one here is related to establishing a procurement framework. So this one's a little more kind of overarching, and you know, the key to this finding is you know, that there, in terms of having a foundational framework to support procurement activities, that doesn't yet exist. So, you know, there's not formalized, robust policies in place, and procurement practices, they're just not being consistently performed or documented at this point. So, you know, like I said, since there was a dedicated procurement lead brought in about a year ago, you know, we've definitely seen some improvements during that time, you know, efforts to develop a procurement policy, but still with only, you know, 2 FTEs dedicated to procurement, if that, there still really isn't that level of support needed to run an effective, you know, and more formalized procurement function. So, that's kind of what we had noted here, just from a high level, and the recommendation is really just to make sure that that development of policies and procedures is a priority, and ensuring that, you know, those policies and procedures are in alignment with the regulatory guidance, such as the PPB, DOE rules, and the comptroller's directives. So from this finding, the management response that we received is that management does agree. And, you know, they did note that they, up to this point, have been able to bring new contracting thresholds to the Board of Trustees for approval. And they have started to draft policies for the most common procurement types. And their plan is, you know, from there, they will work through policies for the more or less frequent procurement types, and target completion of that is June of 2023. Okay. All right, if there's no questions on that one, I'll move on to the second finding. So this is related to pre-solicitation planning activities. So that's really kind of referring to activities such as, you know, identifying the need for procuring a good or service, understanding what the market looks like for that item or service, estimating the cost, you know, and kind of confirming that necessary funds are available. And then lastly, determining the most appropriate method to procure. So as part of our audit testing, we had reviewed 40 procurement transactions across purchasing thresholds, which are broken out by dollar amount. So that includes micro purchases, small purchases, and large purchases. So micro are anything 0 to 20,000, small is 20 to 100, and then large purchases is anything above $100,000. So we did see that purchase order documentation exists for all of the procurements that we sampled, and there was a verification of available funds prior to payment. But you know, outside of that, there really wasn't any documentation to indicate that any of the other kind of expected planning activities had been conducted. So, you know, I think this was another piece of it is just, while some of these may have been informally conducted, there is no documentation, or that documentation wasn't retained for us to validate that. So again, you know, assessing the need for the procurement and analyzing the market and any available vendors, you know, isn't something that had been documented. Developing specifications and criteria for the procurement. We did actually have that for one of our 40 samples, but not for the remaining 39. And then lastly, you know, kind of evidencing sort of the procurement method that they decided to use. And, you know, generally we would want to see kind of evidence of sort of that analysis and why that would be appropriate. So our recommendation for this one, again, is, you know, we really want to see these activities be formalized within policies and procedures, and, you know, making sure that any controls and kind of supporting checklists or templates be developed to facilitate these activities. Management's response to this one was agreement, and they plan to implement a number of standardized forms and checklists to ensure that these activities are conducted and that documentation is available and retained going forward.
Hi, this is Tom. I have probably two questions here. When we talk about procurements, are we talking about sort of like going into kind of new contracts, or are we talking about perhaps renewals of existing contracts, right? Because, you know, this can, when we pull the sample of 40 procurements, like what, not to say like individually what were they, but what I'm wondering if there was a pattern, like, you know, are we looking for a new good or service, or is it a good or service that we're already receiving from a particular vendor and we're looking to kind of renew a contract? So I want to understand like how much of that exists, right? Because in my opinion, a lot of times we're talking about maintaining existing relationships, right? So the documentation, in my opinion, could look different than if we're going out trying to find a new vendor for a new product or service. And then the last one is the last bullet point there is, you know, kind of a double negative. So I kind of need a little understanding of what you mean by written without favoritism was not documented. So I'm wondering if you could explain that a little more.
Sure. Yeah, no, great questions. So to your first question, yeah, the scope of this was really more new procurements. So we weren't looking at contract management, you know, sort of after the fact. So this is going to be new procurements prior to having a contract in place. It's not going to relate to contract renewals. And then your second question regarding a statement of needs written without favoritism. So I think this was just a, the way it's written is kind of confusing, but I think the intention was just saying, you know, based on some of sort of the activities that we would expect either through requirements in the PBB or DOE or whatever it may be, or just best practices. We really didn't see any documentation of any of that for the most part across the board. So I'm not sure, Aday, if you have more to add to that in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, the two that we bulleted down there.
Yeah, so that statement, that phrase, statement of needs written without favoritism, I probably should have put in quotes because it was taken verbatim from the PPB rules. So they do require that for some procurements, a statement of needs without favoritism is is created and documented as well. So we didn't see that statement in some of our samples and in 97% of our samples.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions on that one, I'll move on to the third finding here. And the third finding is really just kind of getting into the actual solicitation activities. So, you know, issuing the solicitation, receiving and evaluating bids, and the selection of vendors and awarding contracts. So, you know, I think, again, the results were fairly consistent, with the exception of 1 or 2 samples out of the 40. There wasn't really any documentation or evidence for us to verify that these activities or that these requirements were taking place or being followed. So, you know, again, I think a lot of this just kind of goes back to that, you know, establishing a good framework, policies, and you know, documentation and templates and things to kind of facilitate the process. So yeah, so our recommendation is basically the same, you know, formalize those activities and policies, procedures, implement necessary controls, and make sure that there's documentation and that documentation is being retained for every procurement. Management's response here was agreement, and again, they are planning to implement checklists, include, you know, relevant requirements within the policy that they're developing, and ensure that you know, there's adequate documentation of each of the requirements, and that documentation is being retained. So again, I know these findings, again, were pretty overarching, and I think it was a little difficult because the function still is in development. So there really wasn't a lot in place in terms of control activities and standardized processes that we could look at. So in trying to compare against rules and regulations and things like that, if there's no documentation of it, there's just, you know, nothing we can really validate. So again, our main conclusion is just, you know, one, that building out the procurement function and those standards definitely needs to be prioritized. And then also considering or addressing the issue of the fact that there are limited personnel even now dedicated to the procurement function.
So, Donald Nesbitt, I have a question. So are you saying that there is a need for additional staffing within the procurement unit? And did management agree or at least request to add additional headcount there if need be?
Yes. So yeah. And again, I mean, when you're looking at procurement, because it is a high risk area, you really do want to make sure that you've got proper controls in place, that everything is being well documented. And just as far as kind of the amount of transactions that they're dealing with and the amount of work, 2 FTEs is not really enough to kind of support the level of formalization that we are recommending here. And the department agrees with that, and they would definitely like and feel as though they could use some additional staff.
And just to add to what
To add to
Stacy
that,
is saying,
I'm sorry, a day from management's perspective. In the FY22 budget, we did request headcount for procurement, had to cut that back. In the FY23 budget, we also requested headcount for procurement for temp staff to go full time. and that was also cut. I just wanted to add that in there. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And I was going to point out that the 2 FTEs that are currently in procurement, one of them is managerial level, and the other person is a staff member. So at a minimum, we had recommended that another staff member with certain skills, we were told that they really would need someone with good writing skills to be on board. So that's what we had recommended. And also, some of the requirements would need for them to be able to segregate duties, especially with things like procurement. But, it's difficult having only one staff level employee on the team.
When we agreed with this recommendation, we actually began a process of drafting a job description for someone to work for our current Director of Procurement, Sabrina Hyatt, who we hired, who has a law degree and is experienced with procurement in New York City. That job may be posted by now, or it will be posted in the next few days, and we'll be hiring to add to her staff to help her.
Hi, this is Tom. I have a question about this. Is there a kind of relative or kind of estimated number in terms of the amount of money we spend in procurements? And I would like to know, and I appreciate, Daniel, what you said about how the request for additional headcount was in the budget, but wasn't approved, I guess. I am really interested in knowing, with these kinds of issues, what would be not just the bare minimum, but the number of staff you would need to have in order for this developing department to function properly.
So from an audit perspective, we recommended at least one more person, but I believe Shitra is here and she could probably give us more perspective on that.
Just to confirm, the job was posted in the last 30 or 40 minutes.
And good afternoon, everybody. The job posting, as Andy said, we just got posted. We are in the process of, we were looking into hiring temporary staff, and unfortunately, we were not able to, get candidates at the time. But we are very, very hopeful that with this job posting, we would be able to find someone who can, definitely help us set up the team. During the audit, we did mention, and Stacy also mentioned in a day, that this is a very new unit. I mean, we used to have a purchasing unit. Yes, there were procurement, and we were following, the PPP rules. But the level at which we are looking at procurement now is being, worked on. It's a work in progress, and Sabrina is on board. She joined, I think, early 2021, and this was during the pandemic. Some of the procurements that happened were during the course of pandemic. And we are in the process of developing a process, and we are documenting that. And it's a step-by-step process. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we are getting there. In terms of your questions about your resources, right now we would like to start with our one headcount, and probably we might need a temporary staff in addition to a full-time headcount, but we are happy to take whatever the board approves at this point.
Thank you. And I have one other question. You spoke of a lot of these procurements happening during the course of the pandemic. I am wondering if not policy as much as procedure changed a bit during the course of the pandemic, right? Because the normal way of doing business, I guess, was kind of turned on its head, right? So folks weren't meeting in person, or if people were in person, there was like, social distancing and all those kinds of things. Like, where normal interactions between people didn't exist or existed in a different kind of way. And I'm just wondering if those things were taken into consideration when we went through this audit.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Stacy.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, from the audit perspective, again, because we were looking kind of across, you know, a few years of time that included pre-COVID, that included, you know, while we were remote, that included, you know, prior to a dedicated procurement person as well as after, and I will just say from an audit perspective and a documentation perspective, you know, at the transaction level, there wasn't really a difference in what we were seeing. So yes, while yes, we did take that into consideration, it didn't really factor in from an evidence perspective for our audit testing.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is like this existed before the pandemic and it kind of carried on through the pandemic.
Yes, and that's not to say that there haven't been improvements or, you know, I know they're working on a policy right now, but yeah, just as far as us being able to audit and review documentation to ensure that some of these requirements have been followed, that was pretty consistent in terms of, you know, we didn't really have much documentation that we could obtain to verify these items.
All right, fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, I'd like to add that
Mhm.
the fiscal department operated under PPP rules. They did it without adequate documentation clearly. But the reason we have a procurement department now is that in those processes, they detected a violation of PPP rules. We reported it up to the board, and in response to this discussion with the board, we established a procurement department. So fiscal ops was actually doing the job of a procurement staff while they were doing all the other things that they needed to do. There is a history of use of RFPs in compliance with PPP. It's just documentation was failing. That's my position anyway.
No, thank you. I appreciate that because what I'm hearing is like this procurement department didn't exist and it was just a function in another department that sounded like it had a lot to do, and breaking this out into its own department is to really make sure that when we're talking about procurement that we are in compliant with like PPP rules, etc. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's what I would argue, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions on this audit, there's one more for us to cover. Thank you very much, Stacy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Stacy.
So the second audit that we recently completed is the check and EFT management audit. The goal of this audit was to review the processes for handling checks and EFTs. We wanted to review the controls in place to make sure that they did exist and they were adequate and functioning as intended. In order to do this, we reviewed the processes for handling received checks. So those are checks that participants are sending into BERS for payments for various things like loans or prior service purchase and things like that. We also reviewed how the processes for issuing checks, and that included refund checks, payments to vendors, and expense reimbursements to employees. And then we also reviewed the process for how fiscal ops is handling checks and EFTs that have been rejected or returned to BERS. And then lastly, we looked at the processes around bounced checks. So that would be checks that participants, members or retirees have made out to BERS and ended up being bounced for non-sufficient funds. So we also reviewed these processes against the New York City Controllers Directive 11. So Directive 11 prescribes, it is actually titled Cash Accountability and Control, and it prescribes the controls related to handling EFT disbursements, bank reconciliations, and checks. So overall, we determined that the department had established good controls around these processes, but we did identify some weaknesses in some of the control activities that are reflected in these findings. And for perspective, the transactions we reviewed occurred between April of 2020 and March of 2022. So the first finding here relates to outstanding checks. So outstanding checks are checks that BERS has issued to its members, retirees, or beneficiaries that are now outstanding for more than 6 months. For whatever reason, sometimes the checks are returned to BERS for bad addresses. Sometimes the retirees may be deceased and they send the checks back, or the check, as far as we know, didn't get to the intended recipient, or they're just holding the checks. But for whatever reason, these checks are outstanding. And some of the risks associated with that is that before those checks are cut, the funds are in most cases taken out of the member's account. So there's that sort of limbo period where the money is out of the account, but is not the check has not been cashed by the member, so they don't have use of the funds even though it's left their accounts. And also for the purposes of financial reporting, these checks are summed up and included in our liabilities. So that was just to give a background. So when we were doing our testing, we reviewed bank recs from Chase, and we noted that there were over $8 million in outstanding checks, and some of those outstanding checks were going back to 2012. So BERS did let us know, or Fiscal Ops did let us know that there's currently no process in place for stopping these checks or canceling them as required by Directive 11. Directive 11 states that any checks outstanding more than 180 days should be stopped and canceled. But BERS doesn't routinely do that because of the labor-intensive nature of that process. And also, when those checks are stopped, the transactions will have to be reversed in CPMS, and that could be complicated as well. So we did recommend like a two-pronged recommendation. So the first thing is tackling the backlog of checks going back to 2012. So we recommended a task force to just focus on that and try to resolve that. So things like still trying to reach out to the members to see what's going on, canceling the checks, reversing the transactions, and just making the accounts whole again. And then for the recent outstanding checks, we recommended a couple of things. So we recommended that they proactively track these. So when they're approaching before they get to the 180 days, so somewhere around 90 days, if the checks are still outstanding, we recommended that they contact the recipient to find out, did you get the check? Do we have a wrong address for you? Are you holding the check? Whatever the case is, so that they can be resolved or even reissued if that's what needs to be. And then since some of these checks are made out to retirees, there's a possibility that these retirees maybe have moved or are no longer living, or the checks could have fallen into the hands of family members or other characters. So we did recommend that BERS considers suspending pension payments for those retirees who have multiple checks outstanding until they are able to verify or get a proof of life affidavit, just to minimize that risk of fraud. And then we also recommended that BERS establish an unclaimed funds database and make that available to the public on its website so that members, beneficiaries, and even the general public will have the opportunity to to search that database and see if they have any payments or if they know of someone who has any payments on the website. So for management response, they did agree with the findings and with the recommendations, but they did let us know that there will be multiple departments involved in resolving this, especially for the backlog of checks, and that they are going to consult with those departments and devise a plan of action. And that will be communicated back to me at the end of October. So the internal audit charter allows the auditee 30 days to provide a response if they are not able to do so at the time of reporting. So at the end of October, I will be hearing back from Fiscal Ops. And then for the recent checks that are becoming outstanding, they are going to start a process where they send the details to Fiscal Ops to research these, and if cancellations are necessary, to start that process. So if there are any questions on finding number 1, I'll be happy to take that before moving on.
Yeah.
So you said 8 million were outstanding out of total how many?
$8 million.
Yeah.
That's
in a
a
2-year period, how much did you look at in total checks?
This is the entire file of outstanding checks. It's a complete file from the bank recs that goes back to 2012. So that's the whole.
Right, but how many checks will be output in that same time period? I'm trying to get a concept of the
Oh,
volume of this.
I don't have that number because there's no report of total checks that have been output since 2012, which is a 10-year period, but there's a report of checks that are outstanding for that period.
And I want to add something to what to what Daniel asked. I think it's important also to understand whether this has gotten better over time, right? Because if we're going back to 2012 and we're in 2022, you're talking a period of 10 years, right? That's a long time. And 8.3 million over 10 years. I'm interested in knowing how would that break down per year? Like, was it like a million the first year and like 900,000 the second year and 800,000 the third year, or was it something like 100,000 the first year and like 900,000 the last year? You know what I mean? Like I'm wanting to understand a trend, right? Like, has it gotten better over time, or has it gotten worse over time, or has it been pretty consistent throughout the 10-year period?
So what I can do is provide further analysis on this and share that with the committee at a later date. I do have the entire file in my work papers, but I don't believe I will be able to run that report right now. And the format in which, so the file is in a PDF, so converting the file into Excel is a little bit shaky.
Yeah, a little tricky. Gotcha.
Yeah, so we were able to convert it into PDF, but if you're looking for like a year-over-year total, I will be able to produce that, but it'll take some time to
No, that's fair,
run.
and I appreciate that
Okay.
because
Just for some relative though numbers, Tom, we distribute in excess of $300 million in benefits annually for the last 5 years on average. Call it on average, and that underestimates it. So you're talking about between 2.5 and $3 billion of money flows in that 10 years approximately. So
yeah, I get it. It's kind of like a penny on a dollar or something, right? But I guess
but it is someone else's money though.
right, and I'm just wondering if it's something that has gotten progressively worse over time or something that has gotten progressively better over time, right? Because, and I'll just say this, right? Because I understand a lot of the historical conversations we've been having about like the condition of BERS, like historically, and things we've been trying to do to improve the system. And I'm just wondering how those processes have played out in terms of this, right? Like, has it gotten better over time so members are less likely to not receive their money?
It's also
So
would be interesting to me, Ade, if we could identify what transactions this involves, if we can describe it, because I'm aware that we do have international retirement benefit recipients who must get checks because they cannot accept EFTs to foreign banks. So it wouldn't surprise me if a fair portion of these checks were international distributions, which can be squidgy at times. We have had periods where people called up and said, you know, I haven't got my last 3 retirement checks. Where the hell are they? So
Okay.
it'd just be interesting to see if there's a profile for what, you know, what's causing this issue.
Okay. I can tell you that a lot of them are retirees though. So, and then the other thing I wanted to point out, so BERS will always have outstanding checks, just like the other retirement system. So this is not a problem that is unique to BERS. I did speak to some of the other audit directors at the other system, and they do have this issue. I think what the more important thing is that we are not actively doing something about it, right? So if we are able to demonstrate that we are doing our part and taking the necessary steps to bring this to a minimum, then I think that that would suffice. So the goal of this was to highlight this and get the department to start to focus on tackling this as opposed to just carrying it conveniently, you know, year over year.
Yeah, Donald Nesbitt here. I was going to even add to that. The recommendations I think are great. That you have recommended to leadership and to fiscal officer actually do. Even on the union side, I can tell you, it would be interesting from your end, Monday, to find out how many of them are members of the system who may have passed away over the course of time. Because even internally in the union, we get thousands of pieces of mail that are returned over time, and people just don't notify you that someone has passed away. We did an audit and we found that we needed to create a unit to just reach out to people when we're getting this mail back, right? So I think the recommendations are actually great, that there is a follow-up process, and that the leadership is actually looking at this. So I just wanted to add that to it, because even on our side at the union, we took for us to do an audit after receiving thousands and thousands of pieces of mail back for us to say, hey, this is a problem, let's look into this. And what we found in most cases were that members were deceased, and either they had no family member who could report it, or just no one reported it to us.
Thank you, Donald. All right, so finding number 2 has to do with bounced checks. So these are checks that participants, so retirees or members, have made out to BERS to pay for something that could be prior service or loans or arrears or things like that, that BERS has received in good faith and in some cases has deposited. And then subsequently, we get a notice from the bank that the check has bounced. So at that point, if the check has been deposited, then it would have to be, the transaction will have to be reversed, and the credit that BERS has made on those payments would also have to be reversed. So in our testing, you know, to take it a step back, so even before deciding whether to reverse the transaction or not, there's the responsibility to contact the member and let them know that their check has bounced, and also give them that opportunity to either make a new check or a new payment to BERS before we do take that final step of reversing the transactions. So in our test, 50% of the samples that we looked at did not have documentation on file or any documentation to show that the members had been notified of their bounced checks. So the risk here is that if that information is not present to all parties who need to see it, there's a risk that any credit that has been given to a member's account from those payments may not be reversed. So it is imperative that anytime a check is bounced, that the member is notified and the appropriate steps are taken. So we did recommend that that notes are entered into the programs that are used for handling so lump sum program and CPMS, and also that the participants are informed in a timely manner and given the opportunity to send us a new form of payment. So as far as management's response, they did agree with the findings and the recommendations, but they also let us know that there will be multiple stakeholders and departments involved here, and we're going to consult with them and devise a course of action and get back to me at the end of October. So finding number 3 relates to checks that are made to BERS by members. A majority of the checks that we receive are processed through JP Morgan. So there's a digital lockbox service that they provide to us where the checks that they receive are deposited on our behalf and credited to BERS's accounts. So the issue, and then some checks also come in to 65 Court Street where members walk in. They could be, sitting with a counselor for retirement and decide to write a check for something. But for whatever reason, some checks do end up trickling in to BERS. So the concern here was that BERS does not issue payment receipts to members. And so it's difficult for BERS to determine if all the checks deposited are actually all the checks that are cashed if there is no receipt being issued to the member. The goal of issuing the receipt is, if something nefarious happens to a member's check and they don't get that receipt, there's the potential for them to contact us and say, hey, I made a payment, I didn't get a receipt. Did you get my check? So we did recommend that BERS should implement a process where they are confirming receipts of checks. We left it up to the department to determine what was more efficient for them, whether emailing, sending the members e-receipts when their payments are received, or sending them a paper receipt. But we did feel that it was pertinent for them to issue receipts on payments received. And if there are any questions, I'll take that before going on to the last finding.
Yes, this is Alan. I have a quick question back to the bounce checks. Do we know, typically for me, when a bounce check hits, we get penalized, right? With a certain number, whatever charge it is on both sides. Do we know if, what the amount is? If there is, because that's a lot of money wasted, just by that,
I don't believe, Chitra, can you please confirm? I don't believe that, is there a charge to BERS if we receive a bounce check?
There is a charge, but it is taken from the controller's side. But however, the bounce check, the frequency of the bounce check is it happens very rare. I mean, it's not frequent. Say we could have a bounce check in every 3 months, so that's the frequency we are looking at. We used to ask the member to send us $9 for the bounce check, but I mean, it's optional. We didn't mandate that. But the frequency of the checks being bounced is very rare.
Okay, thank you. My whole point is that accumulated through time can be costly, and whatever measures that's going to be put to make sure that we send back out to ask for new payment, this penalty may be a good idea to have that incurred by the issuer and covered.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the last finding relates to bank reconciliations. According to Directive 11, all of the city's bank accounts must be reconciled on a monthly basis, and this is also a best practice. In our audit, we noted that the bank recs are only performed once a year, at the end of the fiscal year. And management did let us know that this was because they are currently short-staffed, but that they are maintaining the bank recs on a monthly basis and doing the reconciliation once a year. So our recommendation was that they ensure that the bank recs are done on a monthly basis just to make sure everything is balanced, and if there are any issues, they can be detected and remediated quickly. So management did agree with our finding and recommendations. They are currently interviewing for a full-time employee that will support the bank reconciliations on a monthly basis. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them before moving on. So you did have your hand up, Alan. I don't know if it was for this one or the prior one.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that was for the prior one, so thank you.
Okay. All right, so that is it for the audits that we've completed since the last audit committee meeting. In terms of what we have going on this calendar year, we're currently working on the variable program takedown audit. We're currently in field work for that. We're also in field work for an IT audit around logical and physical access security. And then 2 audits were scheduled to start shortly, the TDA refunds audit and an audit of travel and expenses. And then the annual financial statement audit by Grant Thornton is also currently in progress. All right, so lastly, I have a report here on the status of prior audit findings. So chart 1 to your right here shows the findings that have been remediated since the last audit committee meeting that was held in June. So since then, 11 findings have been fully remediated. 7 of those were rated high risk, 2 were rated medium risk, and 2 were rated low risk. And then chart number 2 below shows the remediation status from an overall standpoint. So, giving a full picture of all the findings. So 42% of all the high-risk findings are fully remediated. 58% are in progress or scheduled for remediation. And then when it comes to the medium risk findings, 43% are fully remediated, while 57% are in progress or scheduled. So just to give a high-level rundown of the high-risk findings that were recently remediated since the last audit committee meeting. So the first 3 were HR related from the employee experience and retention audit that we did earlier this year. So some of the outcomes of that is that the executive office has committed to ensuring effective communications. This was in response to a finding relating to communications within departments and across departments. So the executive office will be the driver for furthering effective communications. And then the timekeeping policy was recently finalized in response to the finding around temporary employee timekeeping. HR did let me know that this will likely have to be updated because they're in the process of securing a new vendor for temporary employees. But yeah, but for now, they do have a timekeeping policy in place. And then very importantly, we had a finding around employees not really knowing where they sit and where others sit, within the organization. People didn't really know who did what. So HR updated the org chart, and they also updated the areas of responsibilities document, and they shared that with the entire staff. which has been very helpful in letting everybody know, if you need something, who to ask, who's responsible for doing different things. And then following that was the finding around cash account issues being ticketed for a long time, for many years. Well, going back to 2018, so yeah, so a few years. The update on this is that most of those tickets have been resolved. There are only around 11 cash account related tickets remaining, and 9 of those were mostly relating to improving the user experience as opposed to tackling issues with the cash account. And then for implementation readiness assessment, we had a finding where there was no implementation readiness assessment conducted before Velocity was released. At least it wasn't documented. So the Velocity team has documented an IRA that they will be using going forward for future upgrades and deployments. And then there was also a remediation attached to payment vouchers. So at the time, vouchers were really on a delay and they were prepared months after the disbursements had been issued. But currently Fiscal Ops is up to date and they are preparing the vouchers around the time of disbursement. And then finally, the SOPM, the Standard Operating Procedures Manual, relating to handling service credit purchase or SCPs within the cash account was updated to include how those processes will be handled going forward. So if there are any questions on this slide, I'll be happy to take them before going to the next one.
Yeah, this is Tom. I do have one question. I guess it's kind of a follow-up, right? I would be very interested in knowing um, uh, what the impact of the remediation is on these particular issues, right? So how effective are the remediation or was the remediation on these particular issues?
I'm sorry. So you said what action was taken and the impact of that?
No. What I'm saying is, you saying these issues have been remediated, right? Like, we had an issue with this, with timekeeping policies, right? And what I'm interested in knowing is if the timekeeping policy has been updated and finalized. As kind of a follow up, I would like to, know at some future point, right? Like, how effective were the updated timekeeping policies? And that's a future audit, right? But
Right.
I just wanted to flag that, like, sometimes we can make changes to kind of address a problem right in front of us. But I'm interested in knowing what the long term or the longer term impact of policy changes are.
Right. Noted. So when we get to the point where we're able to do repeat audits, that will be very apparent. There's only one audit that we are repeating so far because it's mandated. And we do try to present prior findings as a parallel with current findings. We try to retest the same things and see what the trend is and any improvements or improvements.
Thank you.
Okay, so chart number 3 shows the distribution of high and medium rated findings that are yet to be remediated from a department standpoint. On average, most of the departments have about 8% of their high risk findings still open, except for fiscal ops with 3%. In terms of medium risk findings, HR has the highest, currently open at 26%. Followed by member communications at 16%. The velocity team and fiscal ops have the lowest percentages at 3 each. To give a quick rundown of things that are still open, is the issue with the high rate of lost calls, the issue with approval of timekeeping records and overtime records, So goals and performance measurement. And I will talk in the next slide about some of the progress that has been made on these open items, but I just wanted to mention what the open items are. So we have the issues related to goals and performance measures and feedback, leadership development and training, the processing of defaulted loans, and also related to loans is the cash account cleanup. And also related to that is the cleanup of SCP and arrears also within the cash account. And then continuous vulnerability management has to do with our patch management tool that is going to be implemented or it's in the process of being implemented. And then at the time of the audit, there were no user access reviews of administrative accounts. We also did not have, BERS was not able to demonstrate that backups were taking place as required. There was no post-implementation review of velocity, and the financial reporting process was still manual. So those are some of the high-risk findings that are still being worked on. If there are no questions, I'll talk in the next slide about some progress within these. All right, so this is the last chart. It sort of gives us the overall remediation progress for the high and medium risk findings. So for the high risk findings, 50% are in progress, and remediation has yet to start for 8%, while 42% are fully remediated. So those are for the high risk findings. And then for the medium risk findings, 48% are in progress, 9% are yet to be started on, while 43% are fully remediated. So when it comes to those that are in progress, one of the issues was with approval of overtime. So an overtime policy is being drafted to tackle that, and that's expected to be completed at the end of this month. And then to tackle the issue with vulnerability management, IT is in the process of trying to procure a patch management tool, and they hope to have that. They've been having issues with licensing and procurement, I'm told, but they hope to have those resolved by November of this year. And then in terms of the manual financial reporting problem that we noted, some of those key reports have now been added to CPMS, but there's still some testing that will need to be done before fiscal ops can rely on those reports. So they hope to have that done by the end of the year in December. The other issue has to do with the retirement reserves. This problem came about when the retirement factors changed a few years ago. So this is the last bit of that issue being resolved, where they've completed the recalculations on those pensions, but the reserves were still incorrect. And so they've been, operations has been working with the Office of the Actuary, and I believe it was a few weeks ago, the Actuary's office sent BERS a file containing the correct amounts of the reserves. And so BERS is working to reconcile that and correct the accounts. As far as cash account and defaulted loans, cleanup is underway. There has been a significant increase in the amount of loans that have been cleaned up from the loans portfolio. I believe as of this week, they were at around 36% for the cleanup. So they're mostly cleaning up loans that have been paid off, but the payments have been sitting in the cash account. So they're applying those payments and closing out the loans. And then for EFC, so EFC is Employee Feedback Cycle, which is our version of performance evaluations. So this process has been launched for all staff. It was announced at the town hall that was held in June, and it's hoped to be fully extended to both the managers and all the employees by January of next year. And then to address the issue of leadership training and development, HR has secured dates for the management fundamentals training, and this will be completed by spring of next year. And then lastly, to address the issue of backups, IT is in the process of trying to secure an offsite cloud backup service, and they hope to have this done by April of next year. So this is everything that I have for the committee today. I don't know if there are any questions on these. Okay, so if there are no questions, that concludes my presentation for today.
Thank you, Aday. The next item on the agenda is number 5, committee discussion. May I have a motion to consider?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Tom.
Are there any issues regarding what was discussed here today that need to be discussed further, or does anyone have any additional questions? Hearing none, that concludes the agenda for this meeting. The next scheduled meeting of the Audit Committee of the BERS Board of Trustees will be scheduled for the fourth quarter of 2022 and communicated to all committee members and invitees. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Tom.
Second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Hi, John.
Aye,
Hey,
Tony.
Alan.
Any opposed or abstentions? The motion carries. We are adjourned. Good day.
Thanks, folks.